The first thing that disappears is the horizon. It happens without warning. One moment, there is a faint seam dividing earth from sky, a thin grey line trembling in the heat. The next, it's gone, swallowed by dust that climbs in slow motion, curling upward like smoke from a battlefield funeral. Inside the cockpit, there is no drama, no music, no heroic declaration. Only the quiet tightening of a man's jaw as the world outside the windshield dissolves into nothing. Altitude 90 feet. Airspeed bleeding down through 60 knots. Below, somewhere in that blindness, wait men who do not miss. The aircraft is grotesquely vulnerable here, heavy, slow, loud. Its rotor blades beat the air into submission with a deep, rhythmic thump that can be felt through bone more than heard. Every rotation announces its presence for miles. Every second it hangs in the open sky, it dares someone on the ground to take the shot. And yet, inside the cabin behind him, sit the most feared soldiers in Britain's arsenal, the operators of the Special Air Service. They do not speak. They do not need to. Their faces are blackened with camouflage that has turned to paste with sweat. Their weapons rest across their laps, held with the absent-minded intimacy of lifelong companions. They are legends, though no one will ever officially admit it. Men who cross borders without permission. Men who exist in the margins of maps. Men who are about to step off into hell. But none of them are flying the aircraft. That burden belongs to the man in front. He cannot see the landing zone. He cannot see the ground. He cannot even see his own death coming if it's already on its way. He flies anyway. This is the paradox no one celebrates. History remembers the shadows. It forgets the man who carried them there. The approach had begun 8 minutes earlier, slipping low across the barren expanse of the Dauphin, where the earth looked flayed open, raw and hostile. There were no lights, no markers, no runway, only a set of coordinates whispered through layers of command, passed down like contraband. The aircraft descended in stages, trading altitude for uncertainty. 500 feet. 300. 100. At that height, the pilot could see individual rocks scattered across the desert floor. Each one cast a shadow sharp enough to mistake for movement. Each one threatened to become the last thing he ever saw. His hands never stopped moving. Tiny corrections. A fraction of collective pitch. A breath of cyclic forward. Not enough to notice, enough to live. Behind him, the SAS operators waited with perfect stillness. Their calm was not reassuring, it was isolating. Because their job would begin when his ended. And if he failed, their legend would die with him. This was the humiliation no one spoke about. To carry warriors into battle and never be counted among them. To deliver them into history and then vanish from it. To be the bus driver. Unseen. Uncelebrated. Replaceable. A warning light flickered briefly on the instrument panel. Dust, ingestion. The engine was choking on the very air it needed to survive. He ignored it. There was no choice. Power settings held steady. Rotor RPM remained just inside the margin between flight and gravity's claim. Outside, the dust thickened into a solid wall. Visibility dropped to zero. This was the moment. The blind landing. Every instinct screamed to climb, to abort, to escape the invisible ground rushing up to meet him. Instead, he descended. Slowly, carefully, trusting numbers more than senses. 30 feet. 20. 10. The impact when it came was gentle, a soft, almost affectionate contact between machine and earth. They had arrived. The cabin door slid open instantly. The desert rushed in. Heat, dust, silence. The SAS moved without hesitation, spilling out into the void. Within seconds, they were gone, absorbed by terrain and darkness, until it was impossible to say they had ever been there at all. Ghosts returning to their natural state. The pilot remained, waiting, listening. Every second on the ground was a death sentence extended by luck alone. Enemy fighters could already be moving toward the sound. A single rocket-propelled grenade would turn the aircraft into a funeral pyre. His hands rested lightly on the controls. Ready. Alone. He would not follow them. He would not fight beside them. He would not be remembered with them. His job was to disappear. When the signal came, it was nothing more than a click in his headset. He lifted the aircraft back into the dust, rising blind into the empty sky. Behind him, legends walked into war. Ahead of him, there was only darkness and anonymity. Because if the SAS were the shadows, then the man who carried them had to become something even less visible. He had to become the ghost in the cockpit. In the beginning, the danger was not the enemy, it was the ground. Every pilot trained by the Royal Air Force was taught the same unbreakable law from their first hour in the sky. Altitude is life. Height gave time, height gave options, height gave mercy. At 20,000 feet, the aircraft was a sovereign territory insulated from small mistakes. A miscalculation could be corrected. A moment of disorientation could be recovered. The Earth was distant, patient, and forgiving. But special duties inverted that law. It declared, without ceremony, that altitude was death. The first time a conventional pilot was ordered to descend into contour flight at night, the instinctive reaction was physical revulsion. It felt like being told to breathe underwater. The doctrine demanded they fly not above the terrain, but inside it, threading through its folds and shadows like a needle through muscle. The aircraft itself seemed to resist. At low altitude, the air was no longer smooth. It was dense, alive, and unpredictable. Invisible currents shoved at the fuselage. The control column vibrated constantly in the pilot's hands, not violently, but persistently, like the pulse of a living thing. The engines, optimized for efficiency at altitude, now roared with a deeper, angrier tone, consuming fuel at rates that silently cut into survival margins. Inside the cockpit, the smell changed. Hydraulic fluid lingered in the warm, recycled air, a faint metallic sweetness mixed with the odor of heated wiring insulation. It was a smell most pilots never consciously noticed at altitude. Down here, with the aircraft working harder, straining against gravity and resistance, it became unmistakable. It smelled like effort. It smelled like risk. Conventional doctrine treated the aircraft as something to protect. Special duties treated it as something to expend. This philosophical shift was not written in manuals. It was absorbed in silence. At altitude, the pilot navigated using instruments and horizon, supported by layers of redundancy. On the ground-hugging routes of special duties, those layers vanished. In the early years, before terrain-following radar matured into reliability, before night vision devices became standard, pilots flew blind into darkness that consumed everything beyond the canopy. There was no visible horizon, no comforting separation between sky and earth, only blackness. The cockpit itself became an island of dim red light. Every external illumination was extinguished. Navigation lights off, formation lights off, anti-collision beacons off. The aircraft did not exist to the outside world. This was not stealth in the modern technological sense. It was stealth through subtraction. The absence of light. The absence of signal. The absence of presence. They called it dark noise. Radar, the great equalizer of modern warfare, was governed by physics that offered both threat and opportunity. Radar detection depended on reflection, and reflection depended on exposure. An aircraft high against the clean background of sky was unmistakable, its signal sharp and isolated. But an aircraft pressed close to the earth became lost in clutter. Trees reflected radar, buildings reflected radar, hills, valleys, and ridgelines created chaos on enemy screens. By flying low enough, fast enough, the aircraft became one more fragment of ground. Not invisible, but indistinguishable. This advantage came at a price measured in seconds. At 200 feet above ground level, traveling at 480 knots, the aircraft covered nearly 8 miles every minute. A moment's distraction, 5 seconds, meant covering 2/3 of a mile. At night, that distance could contain an unseen ridgeline, a radio mast, or terrain rising faster than the aircraft could climb. Impact at that speed was not survivable. Pilots understood this with perfect clarity. They joked about it because humor was the only way to hold the truth without being crushed by it. They called it the suicide profile. Not because they expected to die, but because survival depended on a level of precision so absolute that even small human imperfections became existential threats. Inside the cockpit, sensory perception narrowed. Vision became hyper-focused, scanning instruments with obsessive frequency. The artificial horizon, the radar altimeter, the airspeed indicator, every number was a lifeline. Hands rested lightly on the controls, not gripping, but feeling. The aircraft spoke through vibration. A subtle change in airflow transmitted itself through the control column before it appeared on any gauge. A slight buffet hinted at rising terrain or shifting wind. Experienced pilots learned to read these signals instinctively, reacting before conscious thought could intervene. There was no room for hesitation. Hesitation killed. The psychological transformation was gradual but irreversible. At altitude, pilots felt like operators. Down here, they felt like intruders. The terrain rushed past at eye level, no longer an abstraction on a map, but an immediate physical presence. Hills loomed suddenly, filling the windscreen before slipping beneath the fuselage. Rivers appeared as BL. Voids, reflecting no light. Forests became walls of deeper darkness within the dark. The aircraft was no longer detached from the world. It was entangled with it. Every mission reinforced a new reality. Safety was an illusion created by distance. True survival came from proximity, from hiding in the noise. Terrain-following radar eventually offered a technological bridge between human limitation and mission necessity. It scanned ahead, measuring the contours of the Earth and feeding commands to the aircraft's control system, allowing it to rise and fall automatically with the terrain. But even this system demanded faith. The radar did not eliminate danger, it managed it. Pilots are still monitored constantly, ready to override automation at the first sign of anomaly. Equipment could fail, data could lag, mechanical systems could hesitate. And hesitation, again, meant death. The presence of terrain-following radar did not reduce tension, it relocated. Now pilots watched not only the Earth, but the machine interpreting the Earth. Trust became conditional. The cockpit, stripped of external light, became a paradoxical place. Externally, the aircraft was invisible. Internally, every sense was amplified. The hum of avionics, the rhythmic intake of air through environmental systems, the faint creak of metal under aerodynamic stress. Even breathing sounded louder. Time itself seemed to behave differently. Minutes stretched. Seconds sharpened. Each moment demanded total presence. There was no past, no future. Only the next mile. Only the next contour. Only the next decision. The transition from conventional doctrine to special duties was not simply a change in technique. It was a change in identity. Pilots stopped thinking of altitude as protection. They began to think of it as exposure. They stopped trusting distance. They began trusting concealment. They stopped believing survival came from avoiding risk. They began understanding survival came from mastering it. Statistics quietly reinforced this brutal logic. Aircraft flying low-level penetration profiles had significantly higher immediate operational risk. Accident rates during training alone were multiple times higher than conventional flight operations. But combat survivability told a different story. Low-level penetration dramatically reduced radar detection windows. Enemy response times shrank. Interception probabilities fell. What increased the risk of accident decreased the risk of being shot down. It was a trade, not between safety and danger, but between different kinds of danger. And pilots accepted it. Because the mission required it. Because someone had to enter the dark. Because war had evolved into a contest not of strength alone, but of perception. The aircraft that survived was not the fastest, not the highest, not even the most powerful. It was the one that could disappear. And disappearance demanded a kind of courage that few outside that cockpit could ever fully understand. A courage defined not by aggression, but by proximity to the ground, in the silent, invisible world of dark noise. The map they gave him was incomplete. At first glance, it looked like any other aeronautical chart, thin contour lines, pale grids, familiar navigation beacons, but then the absences began to emerge. Entire regions were washed out in blank white. No frequencies, no emergency divert fields, no friendly call signs, just silence printed onto paper. The first time he noticed it, he assumed it was an error. The second time, he understood it was intentional. They called it quietly the ghost map. Because once he crossed those invisible boundaries, he no longer existed. The briefing room had been windowless, the air heavy with recycled oxygen and unspoken rules. The intelligence officer never used the word illegal. He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke in careful language, describing sensitive corridors and dennied environments. He pointed with a capped pen, never touching the chart directly, as if contact itself might leave evidence. There will be no filed flight plan beyond this point, the officer said evenly. No transponder emissions, no radio unless absolutely necessary. The pilot had asked the only question that mattered. And if something goes wrong? The officer didn't hesitate. You will handle it. Not we. You. That was the moment the isolation became real. Because in aviation, safety is built on layers, redundancy, backup frequencies, rescue coordination centers tracking every movement in real time. But here, those layers had been peeled away deliberately. He would be alone in a sky that officially did not contain him. The aircraft itself reflected that philosophy. No national insignia, no tail number. The usual markings had been stripped and replaced with nothing. Even its paint seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a dull matte skin designed to blend into the atmosphere. It wasn't invisible. But it was deniable. On the night of the first mission, the runway lights were kept at minimum intensity, barely illuminating the concrete beneath his wheels. The ground crew worked without chatter, their movements precise, mechanical. No one wished him luck. No one said goodbye. Because acknowledging where he was going would make it real. And reality was exactly what they were trying to avoid. He advanced the throttles, feeling the engines respond with restrained violence, the vibration traveling up through the seat into his spine. The aircraft surged forward, gathering speed until the Earth released him. Gear up. Lights off. Transponder off. With each switch, another thread connecting him to the world was severed. Soon, he was alone with the dark. At cruising altitude, the horizon disappeared entirely. There was no visible separation between sky and ground, only an endless black expanse punctured by distant, indifferent stars. And somewhere ahead lay lines that existed only in politics. On his instruments, they appeared as coordinates, numbers without emotion, but he knew what they represented. Sovereign airspace. Territory protected not just by radar, but by pride. Crossing it without permission was not an accident. It was a statement. He watched the seconds count down to the boundary. 10 seconds. 5. 1. Nothing happened. No alarms. No warnings. Just the quiet realization that he had become a trespasser. The first indication of danger came minutes later. A faint chirp in his headset. Radar illumination. Somewhere far below, someone was painting him with electromagnetic energy, trying to understand what he was. Friend, foe, or something in between. He kept flying. Protocol demanded it. Reaction invited escalation. Still, his body betrayed him. His shoulders tightened. His breathing became shallow, controlled. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to retreat toward the safety of acknowledged airspace. But there was no safety in retreat. Because retreat would confirm he had been there. And confirmation was unacceptable. This was the paradox of deniable operations. Survival depended on remaining a question. The radar contact strengthened briefly, then faded. He didn't know if they had dismissed him as clutter, or if they had simply chosen not to see. Hours passed like this, suspended between existence and erasure. He thought about what would happen if an engine failed. At this altitude, over this terrain, he might have minutes, maybe less. There would be no search and rescue helicopters lifting off to find him. No emergency frequencies filled with reassuring voices guiding him down. Because there would be no record he had ever taken off. If he went down here, he would go down alone. And if he survived the impact, survival might only deepen the problem. Captured, he could not identify himself. Rescued, he could not explain his presence. He would become a diplomatic crisis, contained within a single human body. This was the unspoken truth behind the missions. The risk was not just death. It was abandonment. He remembered something an older pilot had told him months earlier, in the quiet corner of a hangar. Don't ask where they go. At the time, it had sounded like cynicism. Now it felt like instruction. Don't ask because knowing creates weight. Don't ask because weight slows you down. Don't ask because hesitation kills. He understood now that the phrase wasn't about curiosity. It was about survival. Ahead, faint shapes emerged on the horizon. Mountains. Black against black. He adjusted his course slightly, threading through terrain that offered no forgiveness for error. The margin for mistake was measured in feet. Inside the cockpit, the temperature had dropped. His gloved fingers felt stiff against the controls. Every sensation seemed amplified. The hum of the engines, the dry taste of recycled air, the steady pulse of his own heart. He was aware, acutely, of his own fragility. A single human being suspended in machinery, sustained by trust in systems that could fail without warning. And yet, this fragile presence carried consequences far larger than itself. Because his flight was more than movement. It was message. A message that could never be acknowledged. He reached the final waypoint and began his turn home. There was no marker announcing his exit from Denneed airspace. No ceremony, just the quiet reversal of numbers on his navigation display. But he felt it. The subtle shift from trespasser back to participant. When he finally crossed into friendly skies, he switched the transponder back on. A small gesture. A digital whisper. And just like that, he existed again. On radar screens, a symbol appeared. A call sign returned. He had rejoined the world. But part of him remained behind, drifting somewhere over the ghost map, in the blank spaces where aircraft flew without names and pilots learned, without being told, that the most important rule was never written down. Don't ask where they go. Because sometimes the only way to survive is to accept that no one is coming if you don't come back. The moment stealth fails is not loud at first. It begins as a feeling, a tightening in the pilot's chest, a flicker of movement where no movement should exist, a suspicion that somewhere in the infinite black beneath the aircraft, someone is looking back. The helicopter hung in the night sky over western Iraq, its rotors beating the air into submission, its darkened fuselage stripped of every reflective surface that could betray its presence. Inside, the men of the Special Air Service waited in silence, their faces painted, their weapons held close, their minds already on the ground below. This was supposed to be invisible. That was the promise. The pilot held the aircraft at low level, barely 30 feet above the desert floor, flying without external lights, navigating by memory, instinct, and dim green instruments that cast a sickly glow across the cockpit. Every vibration traveled through his hands. Every gust of wind whispered through the control column. He had done this dozens of times. But this time felt wrong. The desert below was not empty. It was layered with shadows, rock formations, dry riverbeds, ridgelines that could hide anything or anyone. Behind him, the loadmaster leaned toward the open ramp, scanning the darkness. The cold air poured inside, carrying the smell of dust and aviation fuel. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset, and the men sitting along the fuselage could feel it creeping through their uniforms. The pilot slowed. The aircraft began to hover. Hovering was the most dangerous thing a helicopter could do. Forward motion was life. Forward motion made you unpredictable, but hovering turned you into a target. The loadmaster gave the signal. The first man stood and moved toward the ramp. His boots hit the metal floor with a hollow clang that sounded far louder than it should have. He clipped onto the fast rope, thick braided fibers hanging into darkness, swaying gently beneath the aircraft. The helicopter held steady. Power balanced against gravity. Every control input precise. Every mistake fatal. Then it happened. A flash. Not from the helicopter. From the ground. A brief, sharp burst of orange. The pilot saw it in his peripheral vision. His brain processed it instantly. Muzzle flash. A second later came the sound. Crack. The first bullet punched through the empty air beneath the fuselage. Then came another. And another. The desert erupted. Automatic gunfire rose from the darkness in violent streaks of light, tracer rounds clawing upward, reaching for the hovering aircraft like fingers. Inside the helicopter, everything changed. The illusion of control vanished. The hunter had become the hunted. The pilot's instinct screamed at him to move, to dive, to accelerate, to escape the kill zone. But he couldn't. Not yet. Because the rope was still occupied. Because a man was still descending. If he moved now, the rope would swing. If the rope swung, the man would die. So he held position and waited. This was the moment no one talked about. The moment of helplessness. The pilot was no longer flying. He was enduring. Rounds snapped past the cockpit, invisible but unmistakable, each one carrying enough energy to tear through flesh, metal, bone. The helicopter shuddered as turbulence from its own rotor wash kicked dust into the air, creating a swirling cloud that made visibility worse. The pilot's world shrank to instruments and instinct. Behind him, the second man grabbed the rope. He didn't hesitate. He slid into darkness. Another flash from below. This time closer. The loadmaster shouted something, but the words were lost in the roar of the engines and the chaos of gunfire. The pilot kept the aircraft frozen in space. Every second stretched. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 20 an eternity. On the ground, the men who had already descended scattered into defensive positions, their eyes scanning for targets, their weapons searching for the enemy they could barely see. They had trained for stealth, not for this. This was compromise. This was survival. Inside the cockpit, the pilot could feel sweat running down his back despite the cold. His hands remained steady. They had to. Because above a certain threshold of panic, fine motor control disappeared. And when that happened, people died. Another burst of fire. Something struck the fuselage. A dull metallic thud, not catastrophic, not yet, but close enough. The aircraft was no longer invisible. It was a beacon, a hovering symbol of vulnerability. Behind him, the last man reached the rope. He paused for half a second, just long enough to look back, just long enough to understand. Once he stepped off, he was alone, and once he stepped off, the pilot would leave. He disappeared into the darkness. The loadmaster gave the signal. The rope was clear. That was it. The contract was fulfilled. The pilot didn't wait. He pushed the controls forward. The helicopter surged ahead, nose dipping. Engines screaming as it clawed for speed and distance. Tracer rounds followed for a moment, then faded, then vanished. Silence returned, but it was a different silence. Behind him, in the empty desert, the men he had carried were now on their own. The pilot could do nothing more. This was the cruel arithmetic of special operations aviation. Insertion was intimacy. Extraction was uncertain. In 1991, patrols like the one described by Andy McNabb during the Bravo 20 mission would learn this reality in its harshest form. Once boots touched the ground, the helicopter and its pilot became ghosts again, leaving men to face whatever waited in the dark. Inside the cockpit, the pilot forced himself to breathe. His ears still rang with phantom gunfire. His hands still felt the memory of hovering under threat. He scanned his instruments. Engine temperature normal, hydraulics intact, no warning lights. He had survived, but survival was not victory, because survival for him meant uncertainty for them. The helicopter flew on into the night, its silhouette swallowed by darkness, its mission technically complete. But behind it, in the cold desert, the real mission had just begun. And in that moment, separated by distance, but bound by consequence, both pilot and soldier understood the same truth. Stealth was never permanent. Eventually, the enemy always saw you, and when they did, everything changed. The hardest part was never the flying, was the leaving. The pilot would feel it in the seconds after liftoff, when the helicopter finally clawed its way out of the valley and the ground began to fall away. The noise inside the cockpit was absolute, rotor blades hammering the air, engine turbines screaming at full torque, warning tones flickering and dying as systems stabilized. But beneath it all was a deeper silence, the kind that settled into a man when he knew exactly what he had just done. He had delivered them, and now he was abandoning them. Below, the desert swallowed everything with equal indifference. The ridgelines shrank, the landing zone disappeared. The figures who had jumped from his aircraft, dark shapes burdened with weapons, radios, and 70 pounds of survival, were already invisible. They had ceased to exist as individuals. They had become a mission. Inside British military culture, there was a phrase that carried a strange kind of gravity, the quiet professional. It belonged most famously to the Special Air Service. It was not a slogan, it was a philosophy. It meant competence without recognition, sacrifice without audience, violence without spectacle. It meant doing the hardest things in the world and never speaking of them. But the pilot discovered something no one had prepared him for. The silence didn't end when the mission did. It followed you home. At first, the relationship between the pilot and the SAS had been purely functional, transactional. He flew, they fought. His job was insertion and extraction. Their job was everything else. There was an unspoken boundary between aircrew and ground operators, reinforced by culture, training, and necessity. Pilots belonged to the sky. The SAS belonged to the earth. But war has a way of eroding distance. It began with small things, a nod on the airfield, a shared cigarette in the darkness before dawn, the casual exchange of information stripped of drama, wind direction, enemy patterns, landing zone hazards, and then, over time, trust. Not the formal trust of rank and protocol, something deeper, something more dangerous. They began to depend on each other, because the reality was brutally simple. Without him, they couldn't get in. Without him, they couldn't get out. And sometimes there was no getting out at all. He would see it in their faces before missions. Not fear, never fear, something heavier, calculation, acceptance, the quiet mental arithmetic of risk versus purpose. They knew the odds. Statistically, special operations forces suffered casualty rates far higher than conventional units during high-intensity deployments. In certain theaters, 1 in 4 operators would be wounded during a single rotation. Some would never return. They boarded anyway. And he flew them anyway. The cockpit became a place of contradiction. It was both a sanctuary and prison. He was surrounded by armor plating, redundant systems, and emergency procedures designed to preserve his life. They sat behind him with none of those guarantees. He had speed, they had exposure. He had escape, they had commitment. The moral imbalance was impossible to ignore. There were nights when the radio would crackle with fragments of chaos after insertion. Gunfire in the background. Breathing heavy and controlled, voices stripped to their most essential function, contact. Movement casualty words designed to communicate survival in its rawest form. He wasn't supposed to listen, but he did. And once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. There was one mission that stayed with him. Insertion had one smoothly, too smoothly. The landing zone had been quiet, the aircraft steady, the departure clean. He had flown away believing for a moment that this would be one of the easy ones. Then, 20 minutes later, the call came. Contact, multiple enemy positions. The tone of the SAS operator's voice remained calm, but the calmness itself was terrifying. It meant discipline was holding the line against panic. It meant they were still alive. It meant they might not be for long. He circled at distance, outside engagement range, waiting for the extraction order that might never come. Every instinct screamed at him to go back, to land, to do something, but instinct was not doctrine. And doctrine existed for a reason. A helicopter on the ground in a hot zone was not a rescue vehicle. It was a target he had to wait. Minutes stretched into something unbearable. Each second carried the weight of lives suspended between possibility and loss. Eventually, the transmission came. Extraction required. Urgent. He flew back in low and fast, terrain masking his approach. The landing zone was chaos, dust clouds, muzzle flashes, figures running. One man carried between two others. He landed anyway. They loaded in silence. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. There was one fewer voice on the radio during the flight home, one absence where presence should have been. Later, after shutdown, after the aircraft cooled and the adrenaline drained away, he saw the blood on the cabin floor. It wasn't his. T-Hat was the moment the truth became permanent. He would always be the one who left, always the one who returned, and always the one who lived with the knowledge of what happened in between. The institution did not acknowledge this burden, not explicitly. Military doctrine focused on mission success, operational readiness, measurable outcomes. It had to. War could not function if it paused to account for every moral fracture it created, but those fractures existed. Pilots carried a unique form of survivor's guilt. They were present at the threshold of violence without fully entering it. Witnesses to consequence without complete participation. They delivered men into danger and then escaped its gravity. The paradox was unavoidable. Their skill saved lives, and their skill enabled risk. The SAS never spoke about it, not directly. The quiet professional ethos forbade indulgence in emotional accounting. Weakness was not condemned, but it was contained, processed internally, locked away. Yet brotherhood formed anyway, in glances, in gestures, in the simple act of returning to the same aircraft, mission after mission, trusting the same pilot with their lives. Trust is not given lightly in war. It is earned through repetition. Through survival, through shared proximity to death. He would never wear their insignia, never walk their patrol routes, never carry their weapons into darkness, but he carried something else. Responsibility and memory. Years later, long after the war had ended, long after the aircraft had been retired, the silence remained, not empty, full of voices. Full of rotor noise, full of moments when the ground fell away, and he rose into safety, leaving others behind to face whatever waited for them in the dark. He had been trained to fly. One had trained him how to live with the leaving.